Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 28, and today I'm here with my friend Teresa Graham Brett talking about respectful parenting. Teresa lives her passion for creating social change by combining work in social justice education with parenting, and is the author of the important book, Parenting for Social Change. The children in her life have challenged her to live according to the values of liberation, freedom, and respect as a parent and human being. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. It's been a while since you've heard from me, and I want to share why it's been quiet over here on the Sage Family Podcast. 3 months ago, I jumped on a plane with a one-way ticket to be by my mama's side as she underwent emergency major surgery. Eventually, my family flew down to join us.
So what are you going to do when you first see her?
I'm just gonna
And moving along with our boarding process,
non-stop.
boarding crate,
If she tries
just
to
like
move,
welcome
just be on her.
passengers that are seated in Group D.
Just
Once
be
again, Group
hugging.
D, one board boarding crate.
She's swimming, I'll still be hugging her.
Yeah.
She's climbing on a giant cliff, I'll still be hugging her.
Oh, yeah.
If she's sleeping, I'll still be hugging her.
Oh, my goodness.
Just hug, 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 hug.
That sounds
Oh.
intense.
She was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. My sister and I lived day and night in that hospital room, caring for her, advocating for her, and loving on her. But surgery, chemo, and radiation all came too late.
A part of the fears that I have now are not just about my own first-hand experience, but about the challenges and the heartache that my own people are going to have to experience in probably the not-too-distant future. And worried that I may not be able to find ways to kind of ease that for them in the time we have left together.
You don't have to expend any energy easing my heart. I told you.
Jokes on the mama.
I told you I'm good.
Yes, you are. You're very, very good.
You did your job well, so I will be okay.
Good.
My heart is full. I will be devastatingly sad, but I will be okay. And because I'll be okay, my babies will be okay.
Okay. I believe that.
After 2 months, the hand I was steadfastly holding grew cold as her heartbeat faded away. I'm now home, doing my best to metabolize the trauma and find a new way to live in a world without her in it. But it's hard. What do you wish you made more time in your life for?
Maybe been able to explore a little more freedom, a little less structure. I would like to have been able to do more charitable things and to involve my children in them in bigger ways, hands-on ways. You know, when it's presented, they glean the important stuff. You know, they pull it out and they changes them. changes who and what they are.
Yeah.
And I would like to have been able to give you guys greater opportunities for that kind of growth and vision of really what's out there in the world, because we see such a tiny, tiny glimpse of it.
Wading back into my work feels good, as it feels like an extension of her legacy of love. But be gentle with me as I build myself back up anew.
When I'm gone, for all the days of my loved ones' lives, that what they always remember first and foremost about me is that I loved them.
You already achieved that. We already know that.
I want that to be the first memory.
I want to give a special thank you to all of my patrons, including new patrons Amanda and Katie, for your generosity, your support, your patience, and your kindness. And that goes for my remarkable coaching clients too, who remained steadfastly loving and flexible with me throughout the last few months. Even as I shared some of the journey on Instagram, my posts were met with an outpouring of light that I couldn't always respond to, but took in fully. Having spent a decade nurturing this community around values like gentle connection and intentional living, I had hoped that I could turn inward and be fully present with my mother without professional consequence. And the way you all have seen me and held space for me has been wholeheartedly felt and appreciated. Thank you all for reflecting back to me what I most needed it, all the loving energy that I strive to put out into the world. One thing that many of you have been doing on social media is sharing a screenshot of your favorite or current Sage Family podcast episode, and it brings a smile to my face every time. So if this episode resonates with you, take a screenshot and post it in your Insta stories and tag me so I can share it in my story too. Post it in your feed or simply text it to a friend. It's one small thing you can do to help spread these ideas and shift the cultural tide. When you actively engage with and support this podcast, this work becomes a part of your legacy too. Today, Teresa Graham Brett is joining me to share a conversation on respectful parenting. Teresa's book had been recommended to me several times over the years by people who know me and my work well. So after having it on my Amazon list way too long, I finally dove in and it exceeded my expectations. She combines research with her professional work in social justice and her personal journey as a mother to walk us from where most parents are now to where we all need to be, and explains why. And that's really to end the cycle of oppression and change the world for the better. Now, tell us your story, Teresa. Who are you?
Oh, what a great way to start, Rachel. That's so I you've told a bit of my story, but I think that as with so many of our journeys as parents and as parents who are trying to redefine what parenthood is in relationship to respectful relationships with children. Of course, it started in my own childhood and the experiences that I had as a child. And then as I went through college and then worked at universities, that's when I started doing intergroup dialogue and a lot of social justice work, and didn't become a parent until my mid-30s, and wasn't even sure that that was going to be the path I would go on, but it ended up being absolutely the path I needed to be on in my own life to learn and grow as a human being. And after the birth of the first child in my life, of course, I did all the things I think that many of us do, and I studied attachment parenting, looked at so many things about the ways I wanted to do it differently than my own childhood, And then both good and bad. There were things I wanted to do similar, but there were many things that I hoped I would not pass on from my own childhood. And then when the first child in my life was 5, of course, I had thought quite a bit about social justice and the stereotypes and the ways in which we enculturate children to accept bias and discrimination and stereotypes. Had really thought about all of those things. But it wasn't until the first child in my life was 5 where this revelation came over me as a result of a video, a recording. If you ever want to see who you really are, watch a recording of yourself that you didn't know was being done. And in it, actually, she was 4 at the time. In it, my partner it was around the holidays, and he decided he was going to take some video. Just I don't know, for whatever reason, just because we had the camera. And in the video, when he showed it to me later, he was all excited. I took videos for the holidays. So I was like, let's watch them. And in that, there was this moment where she was in the camera frame and I was off camera, and she said something to me. And then I walked into the camera frame and I said something to the effect of, if you want me to listen to you, you're going to have to talk differently. You're going to have to use a different tone of voice. And in that, as I watched that, so many things, sort of a smack to the head from the universe, like, what are you doing? And then it just sort of woke me up to the ways in which my relationship with the child in my life was not what I thought it was. And that I was recreating so many dynamics, changed some, but so the underlying dynamics of that relationship were based on control and power. And that was the moment when I thought, wow, if I'm going to talk about, it took a lot of reflection.
Yeah.
There was a lot of shame and guilt and, just all
You got to
these
move through
feelings.
it.
Move through it. Like, people think, well, I had a revelation. And then I went on. I was like, no, struggled. Had a lot of emotions. It was so challenging to reflect on that. And then I thought, well, what do I do? My job is to unlearn what I've learned. And the tools that I decided to engage in were ones I had been using with students that I had used around my other areas of privilege in my life, around my heterosexual privilege, cisgender privilege, which I'm still working on, class privilege, just all kinds of things. I'm biracial, so being lighter skinned, what does that mean? Lots of things I had worked on, but I never fundamentally looked at the age and adults and children and what that really means in our culture and our society. And that's what really started my journey into looking at this.
Oh, I love your story. And there are so many profound lessons that you share throughout that story. And, as I read through that moment of reckoning in your book, I could totally relate to it. Because I think we've all had those moments where, we catch our reflection in a bathroom mirror as we're talking to our child, or a video, someone's recording a video and we can see, the way our face looks or hear the tone in our voice that we didn't really realize was present until we see it a bit more objectively. And like you said, then it's not I've had the reckoning, I've had the moment of insight, so now I can just do it differently.
Right. Yeah. Still working on it, Rachel. Still working on it every day.
Me too. It's a journey. Sometimes people, because I run a homeschool adventure club, and sometimes people will message me and say they're a little nervous about attending because, they're familiar with my work, and what if they say the wrong thing, and I probably never have yelled at my kids ever. I'm like, oh no.
I know.
Okay. I am so perfectly imperfect. I promise you, my children are so perfectly imperfect in their humanity, and no, not at all. Don't worry about that.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
Well, instead of my children, you refer to them as the children who share my life. I
Yeah.
can appreciate the significance of this semantic shift, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to speak to it just right in the beginning so people sort of understand and can follow along as we're talking.
Yeah, I think that part of the ways in which I began to kind of unlearn dominance and control over children, and it's similar in the other social justice work that I do, was to start to examine my own language and to really look at the ways that I was socialized around the language of ownership of another smaller human being over whom I have legal control and responsibility for. And that was one of the pieces that I really had to reflect on, was the word my. And, for some folks, I've met other folks who were much further along in their respectful parenting journey who were like, that's not a big deal. And for me, it was so critical early on for myself to just challenge myself to not see children as being owned by me. They call me their mom. I'm their mom. And I still, there are times I fall into it or I make choices about when I'm going to use it. But I just really wanted to challenge myself to not think about them as chattel, for lack of a better word. If we think about just historically children being owned, women being owned by their husbands, it's rooted in this long history of domination and control by some groups over others. And that is absolutely true of children. It also began for me to think about children as a category, not just the individual children in my life, but as a category of human beings over whom our legal, medical, educational, family institutions exert power and control over as a group and as individuals.
Yes, and I love that you describe it as kind of like an intention that you're setting to try and shift the paradigm, as opposed to, from a practical perspective, being dogmatic about it. And when I read, this language in your book, and you addressed it, my first reaction was of like defensiveness, like, well, that's absurd. Like, I don't say my children because I feel like I own them. And so then my brain was sort of, playing around with it and wrestling it and see if I could, kind of disprove it. And then I just being totally honest, that's like the first reaction. And I'm like, well, wait, why don't you just sit with it for a while? So I took like a couple weeks, and every time I said it, I would just notice like the context I was using it in and how it felt. And then I was trying to use like different language. Like I would use their name instead of like my son or my daughter or my kid. And I would notice how like that would sort of shift the words that would come out of my mouth next. And so I can definitely appreciate it. I can't say that like I never say my kid when I'm talking, and you're probably going to hear it in this conversation. But I really did appreciate that, because it's something that I had never questioned before. And I love to be questioned on things that I've taken for granted.
And I use it still, and it's not dogmatic, right? I don't think any of the things that I talk about are about dogma. It's about how do we shift a mindset that's, and if you look at the neuro and cognitive science around the brain, we just fall in, the neural pathways are built from birth. And so we're socialized in those ways, and all it does, that pause just slightly disrupts it for a moment to say what's really going on. And I've never challenged someone in person, like, why do you use my, like, not into the social justice 2x4 approach, it really was about what have I learned in my own experience in this culture, and how do I disrupt my own thinking as a way to shift my relationships fundamentally.
Yes, brilliant. And it's not like super often that I find myself in the parenting world being challenged and questioned on something that I had really never considered before. So I totally appreciated that about this book. Like it really gave me something to wrestle with for a while. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is mainstream control-based parenting and why do we want to step away from it? In your book, you really first address that whole like where most parents are piece. And so I wanted to give you a chance to do the same thing, meet a lot of the listeners where they're at right now.
Yeah. So when I started writing for myself to undo my own learning and to get to a different place, I started to think about what really is control, like what's the core of controlling, the control paradigm of parenting. And it shows up in a number, there's authoritarian parenting. I started reading some of the literature around research about parenting and also different methods, authoritarian. I can't remember the 4 paradigms, but I'm not going to go over it. It doesn't matter. It's not relevant for me right now. So what it made me think about was the ways in which, and looking at some of the sociological writings of children and childhood was really interesting for me. And what emerged out of it was this understanding that I developed from all those my own experiences as well as what I read about the fact that we view childhood, and this comes out of, I can't now remember the author, but we see childhood as a long process of socialization to produce adults who then engage in our culture or our society in particular ways that are about production, about producing valuable citizens who then go into the workforce and then produce things. So there's and of course, children are in a developmental process, 100%. So we have to care for them. We have to nurture them at those different stages. But control is not always necessary. In fact, I challenge myself to think about when is control even necessary. And so the, mainstream parenting views children as less than adults. And so what that then gives us permission to do is to exert control because they are, and none of us want to say this is how we think of children, but if you look at the language that's used about children, the underlying control and power that we use, that they're less than and they're less human until they reach a certain developmental stage. And then we consider them to be human. If you think about language about toddlers and they're wild and need to be tamed and temper tantrums. Then we talk about teenagers in the same way, breaking them, I've looked at a lot of writings about how parents ought to parent. And they're really around this belief that our job as parents are to tame them and to control them so that they develop into proper adults. When in fact, there's so other literature and writing and research out there about the fact that none of that's actually all that necessary. And so mainstream authoritarian, controlling parenting has at the core that long childhood necessitates control in order for us to produce the right kinds of human beings at the end of that process.
Yeah, and the formula is like first of all, something you said about how we really dehumanize children, because we know that, dehumanization is like a necessary step on the path of revoking people's rights or justification for not giving them rights or not honoring their rights.
Absolutely.
And so that definitely, we think of that in terms of like race and in terms of, all these other areas of privilege, but also with children, like we have to dehumanize them, and we often do in our language, and we do in the way that we talk to them and the way that we raise them. But also, like you said, there's this assumption that because this cycle gets perpetuated through the generations. So where we are today is at this assumption that you must train your children through these control-based and shame-based means in order to have a full human being on the other side. And ironically, like when you ask parents, like, what qualities do you hope your children have in adulthood? It's things like independence and assertiveness and creativity and all this. But then they think the path to get there is through like not giving them any of those things.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's really a product of the ways in which we were trained as children. And so in many ways, the work that we do to come out of that place is to both understand that we are products of the same system. And so we're trained to believe those things. And in some ways, that system is not personal, right? It's about perpetuating the same system because that's how this society functions in particular. Other societies and, indigenous cultures and, other cultures might operate differently. But in many, many Western and other cultures, this sort of control is there at the core. And so as products of that, our own system, we often struggle with our own guilt and shame once we realize how we treat children if we want to do it differently. But it's also depersonalized because we do what we've learned to do. And so our journey to undo that is deeply personal, but the responsibility, the ways that we got here are actually depersonalized. It's systemic. It's just a system that starts in our families, that is carried through all sectors of our society.
You have this great quote. We've seen the evidence that shows how harmful control is to children and their development. That evidence resides not only in research, but also in our own experiences as children and adults. And I love that quote. I read it. I was like, oh, yes, just letting it soak in. It just speaks to it so clearly. Like, so often parents want me to, give them all of the evidence that shows that control is harmful to children. And there is absolutely evidence that shows that. But it also really kind of always circles back to, like, you lived that when you were a child. And how did that feel? And part of why adults are so personally invested in maintaining the system is because they feel they have this sense of, like, I can only reclaim the power I was denied by exerting it over children now that it's my turn.
Yes, that is exactly it. That's what we're also trained to do. We heard that as children. Well, when you live in your own house, you can make the rules.
Yes.
When you move, when you pay the bills, you get to make the rules. We are promised that throughout our childhood.
Yes. Like you might feel so disempowered right now, but it's going to be your turn and you're going to get to exert the power, and then you're going to regain that inner sense of wholeness that you were denied your whole childhood. And so oftentimes when I'm working with families, that is something that we butt up against. But then once you get to it and you shine a light on it and you bring it into awareness, then you can really start working on it. Like, so you need to get your sense of personal empowerment from in other ways in your life than by exercising control over other people. There are other ways to get that.
Yes. And that's the liberation.
Yes.
That is involved in shifting this paradigm, in us doing the personal work to move to a different place, is we actually liberate ourselves in the process.
Yes. And also because it doesn't work very well. Because then what happens is you only feel good and whole if your child is mindlessly obedient to everything you say. And so then if you tell a child to do something and they don't do it, then not only is that thing not getting done, which really isn't the issue, but you feel like your power has been taken away. Like whether or not you feel empowered is based on what your child says or does, which it just sets you both up to fail.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, what are the qualities of the supportive, respectful style of parenting that you are advocating? So what does it look like?
I think that it looks like a number of things. I think that one, what it does look like, there's to me two processes, sort of, well, there's many processes.
No, there are only
but
two. You promised me.
There's only two. One of them is about what's our internal work to understand the impact of control, our own controlled childhoods, and all the learning that came from that, and all the ways in which our brains were trained, and the harm that was done through those systems and those experiences. And so doing that then allows us to, in many ways, see children more clearly in their own right as human beings who are different from us, but aren't deficits, aren't a problem. And so one is to really begin to see, and attachment parenting is connected to this. I took attachment parenting, not everyone does, but because I had not questioned control, attachment parenting became a means for control. Just say, I was able to turn anything into control in my life, given my own training in control and power over. But I'm not saying everybody does that. But we can all question it, whether it does or not. And so I think the pieces that really come into play are, one, understanding the needs that are there below what we might see as, or what society or we might see as problematic or triggering behavior on behalf of the child. And so one is, what is the deep human need that's being expressed at every moment? Yes. And attachment parenting does address much of that, right? Connection, being heard, seen, valued, mattering. Those are all the core pieces for strong attachment and human development that we know is part of the neuroscience that came out. Much of it was being, of course, looked at, and some of it was out there when I was writing the book. But once I published the book, there was this whole other set of research. I was like, oh my gosh, wish I had read all that beforehand. But that's really at the core. And supportive parenting is based on that core of connection, seeing, valuing them as human beings, full human beings in that moment in time, who are working to get their needs met to move on to the next developmental stage.
Yes. When people ask me, like, what is gentle parenting? Like, in 2 words, I just say honoring needs.
Honoring needs.
That's it.
And gentle parenting is honoring our needs.
Yes. That's why I don't say honoring the child's needs.
Right.
I just say honoring needs.
Honoring needs. Because we didn't get those needs honored in our own childhoods.
That's right.
Which we have to give that to ourselves in order to then give that and create the space for that to be there with the child.
Yes. Yes. You have this great quote that really helped to put it in perspective too. A strategy I have encountered that is useful in visualizing this new way of being with children is to imagine that children are beloved adult visitors from another country who don't know our customs or ways. How would we treat such a visitor? We would give them guidance and support without shame or judgment. We would accept their mistakes, celebrate their accomplishments with them, and cherish the experience of being with them as they explored and gained mastery of our culture. This is how life can be with children when we let go of our fears and control. Oh my gosh, I love that so hard. It really speaks to the question that people often ask me, which is, people often come to me for coaching in a position where they say, okay, I'm 100% on board with the philosophy. I get it. I love it. I'm all in. I've dived in. I'm in the deep end. And how do I, get my kid across the street safely? Or how do
Right.
I know what I don't want to do, but now what do I do? So this is a really great metaphor that just applies so beautifully, because if you had a visitor who didn't understand our culture, like you would speak to them with respect, and you would explain like the different customs that we have, and you would point different things out that you think would benefit them to be aware of that they hadn't been aware of. But you wouldn't be controlling them and shaming them, and you wouldn't be mired in fears about how they're going to turn out. Like, I just think that's such a beautiful metaphor for us all to keep in mind.
Yeah. And I often, one of the conversations I also have when I work with parents or do a, conference talk or workshop or whatever, people will, especially new to this idea of respectful parenting, and letting go of control, is but then there's chaos, and how do they go out into the real world and operate where there's rules? And I'm like, well, part of the role, for example, we had very different environment in our own home versus, say, one of their grandparents' homes. And so or when we would go to swim at a neighbor's pool versus the city pool, where you are told not to run, or not to jump on someone's back, right?
Yes.
And so part of the whole process, especially when they were much younger, was to say, okay, we're going to this place, and these are this place's rules. And so it wasn't about the fact that I thought they should never follow a rule, but what we collectively decided might be ways we want to be together in our own home are different from what might be in place in someone else's home.
Yes.
And so that was the idea, was to make them aware, and they're really quick at picking that up. That's not hard. So if you can only eat at your grandparents' house at the table, snacks or drinks are only in the kitchen, and you can't take it where there's carpet, well, that's not hard.
I
They know
totally
that.
agree. It's a conversation, and
Right.
it's about sort of bringing an awareness that they may not have. Okay, the process of going from that mainstream parenting paradigm to supportive, respectful parenting usually begins by leaning into the discomfort of cognitive dissonance, which is when we find ourselves holding two conflicting ideas, questioning everything in our narrative or frame of reference, and riding out that learning spiral, which leads to individuation. So can you share an example of a time when you were inspired to engage in this process?
Absolutely.
I know that's a big question.
No, it's good, because it could be daily that I'm engaged
Oh my gosh,
in that process. Because we're never quite done. There's no destination. It's just the journey. So what I was trying to think of is maybe a more recent example, because I know that, often we're talking about parents with younger children, but it continues even now in my relationships with teenagers. And I will give one example of a conversation that I was having recently where, as the teenager, the oldest child in my life is, moving out into the world, and, we know what's happening. They're going to moving into adulthood. She's not ready for it yet, but she is. She says she's not ready for it. So I'm like, yeah, you're pretty ready. But, there's lots of concerns on her own part. But she, one of the parts of my job when I've worked on university or campuses, college campuses, is I've often dealt with a lot of student emergencies, and I just sort of see that kind of underbelly of kind of violence and, not to go too dark here, but, violence and sexual assault and, all those sorts of things. So kind of a normal part of, any large place where those things happen. And so she and I were having this conversation because she goes and hangs out with a group of teen friends at a coffee shop on a Saturday night. And so she has also been homeschooled and unschooled. And so we were having this discussion about, what I wanted to say to her was, I'm really worried that you go out in the alley behind the coffee shop at night when you're feeling stress and anxiety, and I'm like, don't do it. Like I almost went there. I'm like, really? Who are you going out in the alley with? I understand the noise might be overwhelming, but this is a problem. And, but I was like, the fear's coming up. Oh my gosh, she's telling me about it. And so really what happened, it gets quicker, the more I practiced it. Sometimes it took writing, it took days for me to figure out what was the fear that got triggered, what was my control response to that, what was the impact, how would I do that differently, what's the trigger then that I can heal so I don't do the same thing next time, which is basically my process with every single thing.
That transformative learning process.
Right.
On a really high level, like an example that everyone could understand really simply and easily is like, say you were raised in a very conservative family in a bigoted culture, and you were raised to believe that, say, anyone who's LGBTQIA is evil, and then you're an adult and you meet someone who is gay, let's say, and they're lovely to you and they treat you well and they have a family and they're meaningfully contributing to society and they're very good people, then you will experience a cognitive dissonance, which creates discomfort. What a lot of people will do is they will run from that and stick their head in the sand because it's uncomfortable. But the path to growth is always through discomfort. If you lean into that discomfort and question all of these things that come up from that dissonance, question these deeply held beliefs that you've had for a long time and that you assumed were fact, question all the way around, and everything in your narrative or your frame of reference. And then you just sort of, like you described it as a learning spiral. You sort of just keep going down the spiral. Well, if those people aren't evil, like, are atheists evil? And are, one thing connects to the next, and just sort of bravely ride out that spiral. And then where you end up is farther along that path of self-actualization. That is growth. And when it comes to parenting, we have to do that near constantly, because every day it seems like we're in a new developmental stage and I'm confronted by some new expectation or assumption that I had that I have to question.
Yes, and it is a daily occurrence.
Yes. The gifts of parenting.
Yes.
Okay, so I want to talk about something you call transformational tools. You have some tools that you equip readers with to help us get where we want to be. So I'm hoping you can talk about some of those. I think you have like guilt, accepting our feelings, mindfulness, awareness, identifying our triggers, knowledge, and perspective taking. I think those are the handful that I pulled out and was like, ooh, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, and so many of these tools come out of the work I did with bringing students together across different social identity groups who then begin to confront the stereotypes and biases that they had learned and that cognitive dissonance that occurs. And then how it is that you work through that when you when you're in the group with power. So as adults, right, we have the power in the relationship. We exercise that power unconsciously. And once we realize that, often then guilt comes up. And so I address guilt because that's often the starting point for parents, is feeling really guilty. Oh my gosh, these are all the ways I have controlled and dominated the child in my life.
Yes.
And guilt often is a stop, right? It's a stop in the process of understanding how power and privilege works. And so what then can occur is that we then want the child to absolve us of the guilt.
Yes.
And that's what happens. I do harm because I'm in a more powerful position. I feel guilty. I apologize. I want them to forgive me. I do that even now. I'll be like, I'm so sorry that impacted you in that way. I'm so sorry. And I want to say, would you please forgive me? Yes. My job, right? Absolve me of my guilt. Well, the reality is we will feel guilty. And what moves us through that guilt is to just be accountable and be responsible and know that's our job, is to be accountable, responsible for what harm we've done. And that the other person's job is not to absolve us of that guilt, but for us to repair the relationship and not put our emotional need to get rid of the guilt on the child.
Yes.
Because that's another power dynamic that often happens. I know that happened in my childhood.
Yes.
And I have done that with the children in my life as well. So I think acknowledging that guilt will just be the shame and guilt are feelings that will come up for us. And the acceptance of those feelings are really important as one step, but accepting feelings goes further than that. Each of us has our own, individual sort of experience around what are acceptable emotions in our families or in our culture. And so for me, anger was not acceptable. And so when I would get angry, I would deny that I was angry, and that would build up. And so accepting that I was angry, because anger was pretty harmful in the adults in my family, I never wanted to express anger. I didn't learn how to express anger in healthy ways. So instead, I pushed it down. I would not acknowledge that I was angry. And then it would come out in a very triggered response where I would yell.
Yep.
And so accepting that anger there's a full range of human emotions. For some, it might be crying. I've worked with parents who have a whole range. I can never cry, or my way of doing this is to distance myself from the child. Mine, in particular, my own, is the yelling. So the acceptance of those feelings, because we're taught as children that our feelings are bad. When when our feelings make adults feel uncomfortable, adults shut those feelings down.
Yes, it's that perpetuating the cycle again and again.
Exactly.
Like we inherit that those feelings are bad. So often when people get stuck at that guilt stage, it's because they feel an uncomfortable feeling or a negative feeling, and they just have to get rid of it now. Like they need it to go away.
Right.
Whereas if we can move into this accepting our feelings and then into mindfulness where we can just sit with a feeling and get and accept it and get to know it and acknowledge it, even like commune with it.
Make friends with it, invite it in.
Yes, I was just about to make friends with it. Shift your relationship with it. Like, oh, anger, what are you pointing out to me that I'm missing? Like, what are you reminding me of that I need to take a closer look at? It is a game changer. I actually have just been working with a family in coaching, and the father was doing a lot of work around this. And in our last session, he said, it's been a total game changer in my work, like in my work life.
Yes! It transforms your whole life.
Yes, it absolutely transforms your whole life when you grow beyond that stage of just feeling something, being overwhelmed with it and needing to get rid of it and shove it down and make it go away quickly. Like if you can move beyond that, it's so rewarding and the growth is immense. Okay, sorry, continue. I just had to jump in
we're
there.
good. We're good. Well, you covered those next few, and I think no, it's fabulous. That's why we're having a conversation.
Yes.
Not a monologue. I think the other piece that became critically important to me is that perspective taking, because that one may not be one that people think about very often. But in fact, when we talked about earlier, right, about our view, how we're enculturated around children. And we are never taught, because of the pieces of our own childhood and the way our society is structured, to our perspective as children was never taken in by adults. And so we don't learn to understand the other's perspective.
So true.
And so part of it for me was to begin to say, it's sort of that what's below the need, what's below the behavior or the ask, it's what's the need.
Yeah.
But it would begin to look at what's the perspective of the child? What is the world from their point of view? So what's their world when they're 2 years old and they're frustrated and they want you to do something over and over and over because they haven't yet mastered the ability to do it? Yes. Or when, I have my own temper tantrums, but of course, as adults, we don't call them temper tantrums, right?
Yeah.
But, right, all of those things, how can I take that perspective? There was one point, I remember when the youngest child in my life was so angry and frustrated, and I just was struggling to see why. And then at one point this child just loves to lay on me, and so he's laying on me, and I tried to begin to name what I thought his perspective was. I'm like, you're really frustrated because your sister is older and can do so many things, and we're all bigger and we can do all these things that you can't yet do. Yes. And he was crying after yelling for a long time and just going, mm-hmm. And I'm like, you want to do what the rest of us can do because we're bigger. Mm-hmm. Yes. And so that's the perspective taking, is like, how can I, like, if they're 4 feet and I'm 5 feet, what does that mean? What's their worldview from 4 feet or 3 feet or 2 feet? What's their worldview with the older sibling? What's their worldview with how they feel about it whenever I say no and I'm not paying attention to how many no's I say in a day? Mm-hmm. How do I really understand, what are they striving for? What do they love to do? What are they trying out new that's triggering me in language or whatever it might be? That my goal is to see the other person's perspective. And I have a particular obligation when I have more power and privilege in our culture, physically or structurally, to see the other person's perspective.
Ah, yes. There's one thing sometimes I hear parents say a lot, that is like a flashing neon sign for that perspective taking piece being missing, is that they'll say, that's not important. Mm-hmm. And like, I hear parents say that all the time to their kids, and like, it's not important to you. It is important to them. So something that, like, it's one of those warning signs where if you ever hear yourself say, and sometimes I will see that thought flash across my mind. Mm-hmm, like, that's absolutely not important right now. And then I have to reframe it. That's not important to me right now. It is important to him right now, or it is important to her right now. Like, it's sort of this flashing light for me too. Like, oh wait, you're stuck in your own perspective, and you need to reach over and view the experience from their perspective. And I love how you walked through that example with one of your kids. I have an example, I think it's in the Sage Parenting book too, where one of my kids calls it like mommy magic or something like that. And I'm like, well, it's not, you're so sweet, but you guys can do that too. Where when somebody is upset, I even have like steps that I help parents walk through when they're in a hard parenting moment. And one of the first steps is reflecting the feeling and the experience, the mm-hmm. child's feeling and experience. And it's basically, it is magic and it works in all areas of life. But like, if someone is upset, meeting that upset with simply reflecting the feeling and experience. And it's okay if you get it wrong. It gives them the opportunity to be like, oh wait, that's not quite the right fit. This word is a better fit. But like just something like, you're really hurt right now. You had hoped that your sibling would do this and then they didn't, and you're maybe feeling disappointed and you really wanted that thing. Just that, taking that moment at the beginning of like reflecting the feeling and the experience of the other person goes so far in shifting the dynamic of the whole interaction. It puts you both on the same side, like as partners in navigating that hard moment, as opposed to being on the other side and saying like, stop crying, or that's not important right now, or mm-hmm. or whatever, or here, I'll just give you a thing. Like that's not what it is. It's that emotional mindfulness piece. If you do that, it disarms all of the defensiveness. Right.
Yeah. And I think that have you read some of Daniel Siegel's work?
Yes.
I love his work.
Yes.
And that piece that he talks about one, how we learn in relationships,
yep.
critical part of our brain development, and that it's a reflection back of our own mind. That's
mm-hmm.
how we make sense of the world around us, is when someone's able to reflect back to us. And that's such an important role for parents in this supportive, respectful, gentle parenting. And I think that it also, when I think about the work that I've done, say, across race or gender or sexual orientation, that often what we feel like is when we're in conflict, because essentially that's what we're in with children at times, right? We're in conflict. And our ability to reflect back their state of mind, one, is a really important developmental piece that is needed for cognitive and neural development.
Yes.
But it's also really important for us to bridge the gap in our differences. And what I will tell folks is they'll often, even if you don't agree, reflecting back what that person's experience is builds the bridge to greater understanding. And so if we're disagreeing about issues of race because we have different world experiences, our identities are different, I can reflect back what your experience is, even if I disagree.
Yes.
Because a reflection back isn't about agreement. It's about, I see you.
Yes.
I hear you. We can build a bridge.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. That was so beautifully and perfectly said. Like, it's not about agreement. It's about, I see you and I hear you. And from there, we can connect with each other.
Yes.
Yes. I think sometimes, like, I'll have one parent who's all on board with the philosophy and another parent who is suspicious of it. And, to that I can say, like, look, even if you are not there yet with all of the philosophy and wanting to be respectful and empathetic and all of those things, if we set all of that aside, this stuff works. Like like the research shows that it works, but also you don't even need that. If your kid is really upset about something and you reflect their feeling and experience that they're having, you will see that you will get through that interaction feeling connected and good, and your child will feel connected and good, and you will move through it with a fraction of the energy and time that it would take to go about it using that mainstream control model of parenting.
Yes, absolutely.
You also talked in your book about the difference between this is not even like written down questions. I'm just literally having a conversation with you. In your book, you talked about like the difference between mindfulness and awareness, which is like subtle, but I find that people do often kind of don't understand the distinction.
Hopefully I can articulate as you were saying that. I'm like, I did write that and I know the difference, so I'm going to try to so you can help me out, Rachel, if I'm going in the wrong direction.
Okay.
I often, so my own, I believe what I wrote and what I believe is that awareness is really about understanding all the pieces that are at play within me. I often think of it as self-awareness, but also awareness of broader societal issues as well. So for me, mindfulness is, of course, a critical part of awareness. You can't be aware without mindfulness, but the awareness piece is to understand that there are many things that are in play. And am I aware, for example, of the ways in which my particular childhood history triggers certain things in me? That those are things that I can anticipate are going to pop up for me. And what I began to do was to notice patterns in my own reactions and my own reactive my own reactions that caused harm to the child. And so awareness is about understanding the particularities of our own experiences that give rise to triggers that then result in whatever, happens with the child. And then being able to be aware that that's could happen, it's come up, and then we can use tools of mindfulness to help us be present in those moments to then be able to create that pause, which is what mindfulness is so powerful for. That pause to stay in the discomfort, the pause to be able to then, give ourselves a little bit of room to not react, but to respond and to move forward in a way that's much more constructive in that relationship.
Yeah, the power of the pause.
Right. But that awareness is, I would often track, or I've asked parents to do this as well when I'm working with them, is like track, if you're getting triggered on a daily, multiple times a day, it can happen to me. What is it I need to understand? How can I get below that because often it's unconscious, right?
Yep.
It's popping up. It's the behavior. My reaction is what points to then what is below that surface. And how do I create awareness under the surface of what's going on below the surface?
Yeah.
And I might find myself tracking those, or ask parents to track them. Are there particular times of day? Is it a particular word that's used by the child, or an action that causes you to be triggered? How is it then you can understand what the tie is, to maybe some healing that you have to do, that awareness piece is what our responsibility is, to do the healing so that we can be present in ways that are for the child, that aren't rooted in our history and our past and the healing that we haven't yet done.
I love that word awareness too, because oftentimes I hear parents say things like, and again, this is just sort of like mainstream vernacular that, a lot of people have just never been challenged on, but they'll say things like, my kid is making me so mad, or, my kid made me so angry today, or my kid made me, no one else is responsible for your internal emotional state or your internal emotional world. You cannot put that burden on any other human being, but let alone a child. So you have to take responsibility for your own emotional world and internal state. But the word awareness, I find, sort of gives us a bridge to share with the people we love how their behavior or choices or words are affecting us without giving them responsibility for it. Does that distinction make sense?
Absolutely. It's similar to when I started to talk about the conversation with my daughter and my fear reaction to her, right? Going out and taking a break from a stressful situation. This is one way that, we talk about managing anxiety.
Yeah.
And so, mine saying, I have an overactive fear. I have an overactive fear that you just need to understand is part of my world and the world that I work in. And she's like, oh, I know, Mom, I know that. And her review back to me was, and I've lived in a really safe bubble. And she said, so really it's both of us meeting in the middle. And so she has awareness that, she knows she's not always aware of what might be safe or not safe. Like, she has great intuition if she's in the middle of something. Yeah. And she knows that I have this overactive fear response to, a teenage girl alone anywhere. That is not necessarily true, because they're alone by themselves all the time. But, and so what we were each could come to the conversation with was an awareness of where we were rooted in our own perspectives. And then what agreements could we make that weren't coming just from my fear and weren't coming just from her sense of safety all the time.
Yes, it's like the first step of a healthy collaboration. Like starting from that awareness of, this is bringing this up for me and I'm feeling this way. What do you think about it? How do you feel about that? Have you considered this? Do you have well, I didn't think of it that way, and I could change this little bit about it, and then I could still do the thing I want, but it would address that fear that you're having. Or and we do that as adults. We should be.
Right.
But doing it with kids, it's so funny, because I have so much unlearning to do and so much learning to do. And when we choose to very bravely raise our children in a way that doesn't just perpetuate the cycle that we were raised in, in a way, I'm almost jealous that my kids are going to have these skills that it's taken me so much time and work to build up.
Yes.
Well, I'm gonna sort of merge two of our quotes here, and I swear I normally don't quote this much, but I just couldn't help it. I was writing down all these quotes that I had to share. Growing up in a paradigm of domination and control, we internalized much information about children that is in fact misinformation. That's one of my favorite quotes from your book, because one of my most popular quotes that gets shared all the time is, your child is not the problem, your expectation is the problem. So that quote from you is like the perfect, first sentence to my quote, which is just really pointing out that explaining why our expectations are so off.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about experiential learning. One of the pieces to your way of being with children is that experiential learning or self-directed learning piece, and you did talk about that in the book, which I was grateful for. So share with us how that piece fits in with the broader mission of parenting for social change.
Yeah. And in particular, Rachel, how I do it as both an adult and then how I see that for children.
Ooh, yeah, let's do that.
Okay, all right. Wanted to make sure that I'm going in the direction that.
I was aware that you're like homeschooler, unschooler, and so I wanted to be sure that we touched on that. But definitely for you too, yeah.
One of the things that is really important to me is as I'm working, because I work with college age students, and that's been the age I've worked with, and in particular doing a lot of learning outside the classroom through experience. And so experiential learning had always been a part of the ways in which I entered education work with college students. But I also think of it as lifelong learning that all of us do as adults. There's ways in which as adults we're learning all the time.
Yep.
We're not being forced to do it in structures, but we have an interest in something.
We're not being graded.
Right. We're not being graded. I have to fix something and I don't want to call someone to pay them to do it. So I get on YouTube. I figure out why my washing machine is making this horrible noise. And I turn it over and I fix it. Like that is what experiential learning is.
Yes.
Oh, wait, that didn't work. I have to watch another YouTube video and then I can try XYZ.
Yep. Natural learning in the real world.
Natural learning in the real world. And there, when I think about children, when we watch children in that amazing developmental years before they go to school at a traditional age, some it's much younger, but it could be 5 if we think of kindergarten, if we look at the huge, tremendous amount of learning that's going on every single day for which they have such a passion and drive, like that our species survives because and thrives because we are so compelled to learn, and that's how we have survived. And so when we looked at that and when I began to change my own paradigms around why do we have to control children's learning politeness or learning how to be in relationships or learning math or reading, we shifted into this idea. And part of it was driven by the first child in my life, much more introverted. And when it came time to make a decision, which we controlled that decision at that age, no, we're not going to send you to school because we know that an environment of 25 kids for 5 hours you will not survive emotionally that experience.
Yes.
And so it started there, but I was also that was at the same time when I had that sort of revelation around the recording, and I really began to delve into what have I not been seeing in this child. And that's when I began to do so much more observation and paying attention and challenging my own thoughts about how learning has to happen. And then it was really easy to say, let's continue to not send you to school because look at everything you've learned in your life. And then, what we saw was both of them intensely motivated to learn. All children are. They're not special. Just want to say, not special. People will say that. Well, I'm like, no. They are like every other child in this world whose basic needs are met, who have this drive to learn everything they possibly can. And so really, I thought, well, I do this with college age students. Why would this not apply to a 5-year-old? When they learned how to walk and talk and eat without me telling them and instructing them how to do that. So we just facilitate what are their interests, what do they want, what are they driven by in those particular days, how do we support that, how do we create this environment that gives you freedom to explore and learn on your own terms in ways that continue to support that internal motivation that every human being is born with to learn.
Beautiful. And I agree with every single thing that you just said. And yeah, it took me like a lot of work to get there. And I'm still, like we keep saying, every day learning more and finding more things to question and to more expectations to clean out and fears to address around that natural learning process. But oh my gosh, it's so worth it to see your children just on fire. So the other night at like 1:00 in the morning, my oldest runs into the bedroom like very excitedly, and she's like, "You have to teach me how to create a Punnett square." And I was like, okay. She brought in a paper and a pen, and we went over the whole Punnett square. And then it was like 3 days of her comparing, you know, the genes for all these different couplings and all these different traits, and figuring out which traits have dominance and recessive and which don't work that way, and all of these things. And like, it's just such that when natural learning is really thriving and when you hold the space for it, it's such a beautiful, beautiful thing. And if you are living life in the real world, like, then they are going to learn how to be proficient at living life in the real world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, I know there's a lot of fear, and it comes because what we were asked to do as children, what our parents were asked to do, was to give up our own inner authority to a system, to say, these are the folks who can teach you, and you have to give that up to them.
And you are not capable of
and you are not
doing
capable
this without me, without the gatekeeper. You can
Right.
only learn here in this setting, in this way, when I tell you what to learn and I tell you if it's good enough.
Yes, yeah. And, you know, at a very early on, probably the second or third year in, you know, we would say to the oldest child, and then it's continued with the younger one, "Oh, do you want to go to school?" Like, you can choose to go to school at any time. It's absolutely your choice. If you want to try that and learn in that kind of setting and experiment with that, like, that's everything's open to you. It's not about, I don't believe in a system. I don't, but I believe there are better ways to do it. And I know that I also have economic privilege and social capital that allows us to do that. And the kind of parenting we're talking about does not require that the child not be in school, because those are realities that many people have. And that's okay. Gentle and supportive and respectful parenting doesn't mean they don't go to school. It could mean that they have to, or that you could really create that environment at home while acknowledging that they will experience something different in other systems and structures, and still create that wholeness and that drive to learn outside of that system.
Completely agree. Okay, I want to, before we move into the Q&A, just throw out this last quote from the book that is so, so good. "The children who share our lives give us the opportunity to transform ourselves so that they can transform the world." And that's like the flavor I want to leave in everyone's mouths as we move from the book portion of this conversation to the Q&A. So I told my patrons over on Patreon that we were going to chat about respectful parenting today, and asked if anyone had any questions about it. Jahira asks, "Could you speak to raising entitled children? It is my assumption that children only come to feel entitled when parents don't meet their basic needs first and foremost, and instead just give and give tangible things in place of that. Then children just need more and more things to feel complete. Injustice, since they aren't getting what they really need, things like unconditional love and respect. Do you agree with this? What, in your opinion, are those basic needs for young children and into the teenage years?" So she's basically speaking to that fear that I have heard people bring up, that if you meet all of your children's needs, then surely they will turn out to be spoiled and entitled.
I hear that too a lot, and certainly struggle with my own fears about that. Right? We all grew up in the same culture and society. spoiled children, don't pick up the baby so much because you're going to spoil the baby. I think that so much of what we see when the child's needs are met is that they're then able to move to that next developmental stage.
Yep.
Right there, that next piece, you fill that need, then they're able to move forward. And when those needs aren't met, that's when the behavior, I don't mean behavior in a negative sense, but then like we have spent our whole lives trying to meet our needs that weren't met in childhood.
Yes.
That's a more tangible way for me to say it.
Yes.
And so when we do that, what it does is, I believe, and I think a lot of the neuroscience and developmental psychology is that when we provide for that, that creates a stable foundation for continued growth. When I, for example, also am willing to take a child's perspective, what I'm also demonstrating is that everyone's perspective matters. Someone who's entitled doesn't necessarily believe someone else's perspective matters.
Yes.
And so what I've seen so often, and it's also a developmental stage. I can't expect a 2-year-old to take the perspective of another 2-year-old. That's an unreasonable expectation, to go back to your quote. And so if I can meet the need of the child, that, sharing at 2, I don't like to share at 53, honestly.
Yes.
Take my favorite thing. I'm not happy about that. And so the ways in which we meet those needs, understand what's developmental, where they're going to develop that empathy and perspective taking, tap into it at those points, that to me is where it really sits. And now I know the thing about objects and things, right? There was a time in my life where I was like, we're never going to have a plastic toy in my house. Yeah. Anyway, got over that, right? I'm never taking you to a toy store because I'm going to control everything in your life. You're going to have really cute wooden toys.
We are anti-consumerists.
We are anti-consumerists. Well, yeah, let go of that control. And what I have found is there have been stages when there has been great desire for so many things, objects. And we've met that in different ways. And we've negotiated through that process of acknowledging the want and the desire. But also that we tangibly can't fulfill all those desires because that's not the world I live in. And so for me, that entitlement piece is complex. It is about meeting the needs. It's also about acknowledging that sometimes we do want things because things are nice. And we all do in the world want them. But what are the other things that we're doing below that? And how is it that in our treatment at each stage, the ways that we see, acknowledge children, respect them, help them to take, that I take their perspective, allows them to see that that's valuable. It feels really good when someone sees your perspective.
Yes.
Then they develop into these full human beings who also sometimes want things.
Yes. That their needs and wants are valid. Like you want them to walk away with that, that knowing that, deep inside and feeling that, because in order to extend that to other people, really they need to feel it within themselves first. Yes. I think that you're going down the quote unquote wrong, I don't want to be so judgy with that word, but the wrong path. Just so I can get through this sentence, I'm going to say it anyway. You're going down the wrong path. If you find yourself withholding or intentionally not meeting their needs and wants when you are perfectly capable of doing so out of a fear of spoiling or creating entitlement. I think really the piece that you have to bring into your awareness to move beyond that fear is that meeting meeting a need is not the same as delivering on every want, but also you can respond consistently and sensitively without necessarily being able to or willing to meet every desire or preference. For example, like from my perspective in respectful parenting, if we're at the checkout aisle and my kid is upset because I'm not buying candy right now because maybe we have a grocery budget and we're trying to stick to it or whatever the reason, the respectful parent in me would get down on their level and, again, like we talked about before, reflect that feeling and experience they're having. You see that candy and you're imagining what it would taste like, and you're really disappointed that we're not getting it, and maybe you're feeling angry with me that I'm the one who's saying no. And I felt that way too. I know that's really hard to feel that way. So that's the respectful parenting piece for me. Respectful parenting or gentle parenting or whatever you want to call it is not, I am able or willing to give my kid every single thing they could ever possibly want. And especially with more than one kid, their preferences are often lying in conflict with each other. So there would be really no way to deliver that 100% of the time. But the point is that I respond to it not from a place of like your preferences are shameful and your desires are shameful, but from a place of like empathy, and then we move into collaboration.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things, to go back to that awareness piece, that came up for me was that, in childhood, money had particular issues that came along with it. For many of us. And what occurred in my own family history around money, and particularly in my own role as I was the person, my partner, Rob, stayed at home. And so I was the one who went out and worked for the majority of the time. And so what I also began to understand is that when Grayson, the youngest child, expressed a want, then it triggered in me, and it cost money, like not a free want. Only when it cost money, it triggered in me the history I had around this conflicted relationship with money. And so often when there's a fear about entitlement, or he's always going to want something and I'm never going to be able to satisfy him. That was my word, right? Like that was the thing that would pop into my head. Below that, what I had to create awareness about it triggering these deep pieces around what money looked like in our house.
Yes.
Particularly with my father, who I identified with as both parents worked, but there was this caught upness. I was caught up in that. So that's, I think, the other piece, that as we ask the questions that we're most concerned about, often they're tied below the surface to some piece that triggers us.
Yes, and so many of us have money issues that we bring to the table. So when you talk about the whole spoiled and entitled fear, just like you said, we are often hooked into issues from our own childhood, issues around money, issues around, all of these inappropriate expectations of what kids should be doing and sounding like. And yeah, it can just be sort of a hailstorm of all of these triggers that we've been having. But like we've been talking about, if you're feeling something like that, like stop running from it and turn and face it and look right at it and sit with it and get to know it better. And then from there, you can see what things you need to learn more about or what things you need to work on. Then you can move through it. But in order to move through it, you have to really face it, which I know Jahira is working on doing with asking this question.
Yes, absolutely.
Hopefully we've helped a little bit with that. Now let's take our deep dive. The show notes can be found at sageparenting.com/podcast28, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So what are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic, Teresa? Your book, that's going to go at the top of the list. That will definitely be linked. So Parenting for Social Change. You all need to read.
Okay, I'm trying to think. That's a great question. I do believe, okay, so one of a more recent one that I read, I do believe Daniel Siegel's book about, I mean, he has many. If you want to go, if you're really a science nerd, The Developing Mind is a great one. But there's also one, I initially got introduced to his work. He wrote a book, I think it's called Mindstorm, The Teenage Brain.
I haven't read it, but I've heard of it.
Yes, that actually, as the first child in my life was moving into the teenage years, was really powerful. In fact, he has us do self-reflective exercises to do our own work around the attachments that we may or may not have gotten as children to help us understand how we can be with teenagers in a way that's very, very different. Powerful book.
Ooh, that's so my jam. My oldest is 13, so I will definitely be getting that book.
So I remember I opened it up to I went and I was into chapter 2, and it says, reflect on your relationship with your parents as the teenage years. And then I was like, shutting the book right now, not in a place.
This is not a casual read.
Yeah, I was like, all right, I got to spend some time on this. That's another one. I do think that's the one that popped into my head, because really so much of what became the foundation for the book were a lot of research articles. You know, if you're interested in general and looking at about power and oppression and control, I do sort of a lot of Bell Hooks works. So she has written some books about teaching, in particular, teaching to transgress, teaching for liberation, teaching for hope. A number of things that she's written were really instrumental for me to be able to shift not only the work that I do with students, but also like, what does that look like? What does it mean for me to deconstruct power in my relationships? And as an educator, but also as parents, we facilitate learning. And that's really how she talks about teaching as the facilitation and the equaling of power relationships.
Ooh, adding to the list.
Yeah,
Got it.
yeah.
And I mean, that's really, your book is called Parenting for Social Change. And so I really want everyone to understand, like, the kind of the moral of the story is, like, there are so many of you out there who are really passionate and driven about changing the world and making our society a better place, especially for people who are marginalized. And like, one of the most powerful ways you can do that is in your relationship with your own children.
Yes. The ways in which our brains are formed and developed within systems of power, control, and domination create the world that we live in.
That is a beautiful ending quote from you. Teresa, thank you so much. And I have to give you a special thank you to, this podcast has been quiet for a couple months as I was with my mother while she was making her final transition, and it was right around the time when we were supposed to record this episode, and you extended so much kindness and so much insight and so much support to me because you lived through a similar experience. So I just want to give you a heartfelt thank you.
Oh, Rachel, it was my honor to be a small part of that journey with you.
Teresa, I love and respect you even more every time I have communication with you. Someday we're going to have to meet in real life so I can give you a big hug.
Yes, I agree.